Hello? Allison. Allison, are you there, hon? All right. Could I have someone verify that you guys could hear me? Hello? Just one person would suffice. Just one person, let me know you could hear me. I see Allison B. That's it so far. It says 3 participants, though, so there's a second one getting on. Allison, the next person, are you able to hear me? Could you verify, please? Just a little message, a little type message, or just a quick word. You're muted right now. Okay, perfect. Perfect. All right. So let's see here. As soon as I see the other name, tell you what, if there're just going to be a couple of you, I'm going to give you extra credit for being on here, okay? So it's still not punishing those who can't make it on account of schedule, but I still reserve the right to bump up. All right, so I'm gonna put extra credit. And as soon as I can see the third person, on my end, it's just saying connecting, and it's still kind of in flux. I'll give that person credit as well. Okay, so let's see here. What I want to do is, I hadn't done it until just about like half an hour ago, but I put the second study guide for the second test up, and I want to go through the first like 7 terms or so, 8 terms to make sure you're ready for the test, okay, when it comes. So notice we're doing the progressives. Then we're going to do, I made a mistake. Normally I do imperialism first. They're kind of contemporaneous with each other, but oftentimes in the books and so forth, most of the time they choose imperialism first, then progressives. And I don't know what I was thinking. I just jumped right in and did progressives, but it shouldn't hurt anybody. And they're about the same time, although some of this progressive stuff is later. So at any rate, what I want to do is want to ask you, does anyone have any questions about the argumentative assignment? Anything unclear? Any thesis not really strong or unclear that you're not certain about, that you're choosing to write on? Anything of that sort? All right. So be sure that you're reading the introduction, okay, on the progressives. So speaking of which, let's jump right into it. Number 1, a characterization of the progressives generically is 1, they were members of the old middle class. And what I mean by old middle class is mainly the intelligentsia, those who owe their income and their job and their prestige to their education. They were anomalously out of the ordinary educated. Just having college degrees was out of the ordinary still by the late 1800s and early 1900s. So they were old middle class. They were lawyers and writers and professors at big universities, well-to-do, older established businessmen and women, etc. Right? But most of the time, like I said, they were involved one way or another with things intellectual, the intelligentsia. And then secondly, they wanted to rectify what they believed to be perceived injustices, inequities, problems with the industrial era. And we've gone over some of those things, right? We're going to get into them very soon. And so they wanted to help improve, right? Rectify what they perceived to be injustices, inequities, and problems of the industrial era of their time period. And then thirdly, another generic thing that's agreed upon amongst historians is that progressives were by and large for larger government and larger government involvement. So this is going to begin the paradigm shift of liberals being more pro-government, bigger government, all right, with a progressive movement. And so they wanted to get involved in the economy, and of course in their rhetoric as well as in oftentimes their actions, as they wanted to, in particular, there was a sense that there was an imbalance There was a great imbalance of big business, right? Having too much power, too much leverage over the economy, etc. And they wanted to help rectify that, to help tip the balances toward better sense of equilibrium and empowering those who are below on the socioeconomic pyramid. And they also had no problem with government intervention in social issues, which is much more controversial. So like alcoholism, prostitution, divorce, things that sometimes are considered just a separate private realm in American political tradition. They had no problem with the government coming in and regulating. Okay. So that's number one. All right. Number two, what were some pivotal fronts or issues that they took on as far as their crusade? Well, one, as I pretty much have hit upon it, is wealth inequity. They were concerned, like I have in the introduction, that so much of the wealth was being accumulated by so small percentage of the population. That the big businesses, remember number two in your Gilded Age handout, the first one before immigrants, on the robber barons just easily gobbling up their competition, right? That concerned them, to say the least. And also it concerned them that there was almost a sense of a glass ceiling. Glass ceiling implying, right, that because it's glass, you can't see it. There was nothing overt in law, perhaps, to say that Italian immigrants can't make it to the foreman position in their factory, or can't earn a certain degree, or can't be promoted to a certain white collar position. But it just wasn't happening nonetheless. So hence it was a glass ceiling. They oftentimes use that term for women in American history. So at any rate, they were concerned about that, to say the least. So what were some of the things that they tried to take on and do to rectify that wealth imbalance? One was they wanted to regulate big business. In particular, they wanted to stop what they considered the trusts. Trust, right, is an amalgamation, a joining of two big corporations, of their stock, of their supplies, meeting and conspiring on prices against smaller competitors, any way in which the big guys were teaming up with one another. Okay, that was seen to have been unfair, unethical, and hence they wanted to become illegal, right? And so, for instance, remember the Lakeshore deal by Rockefeller. He told a major railroad, if I can get 6 tons of oil and you could charge me by the pound, if I can guarantee you 6 tons of oil that you could charge me for a week, will you give me a 60, it was like a 62%, they agreed upon it. It was a big one, rebate, right? Reduction of how much per pound you're going to cost me, as opposed to what you'll charge everyone else. And they took him up on that offer because he was able to make a similar deal with another rival railroad, and they could make a lot of money by economies of scale, just by having 6 tons a week to be able to charge him for. So at any rate, he went to a couple other big oil companies and said, I can't quite make it to 6 tons a week. Why don't you join your oil, your crude oil with mine? We'll separate it when it comes to be refined, and together we'll get this rebate together. And the smaller private guys, they couldn't get this rebate. That gave them a huge advantage. So at any rate, with trusts, they wanted to break that activity up. They wanted to have a law that made sure that it would not happen anymore. And so the result was called the Sherman Act, or the Sherman Antitrust Act. But the problem was it was a bit vague. And it said any conspiracies, right, or combinations in restraint of trade and competition are hereby prohibited. And not to mention the Antitrust Act, the Sherman Act, just didn't seem to have been carried out very effectively or very consistently. But nevertheless, they gave it a try, right? Another thing is with white collar crimes, along with trusts, people were avoiding paying taxes, all kinds of things that they could be doing. Another big one was graft, whereby a big Rockefeller type businessman. Okay, Yuritsa Buenrostro, thank you. I see your name here, hon. So at any rate, they would, sorry, I'm a terrible multitasker, aren't I? So let's see here. They would, where was I? With white collar crimes, right? They would find out when an area was to be deforested and developed, and they would find out through a city council member or through their inside information, and they would trade for that property so they could sell their property at an inflated price later on. So that's just one example graphed of white collar crimes that were going on, and they wanted to put an end to anything that gave an unfair advantage to big business. Then they wanted to help out the those below, right? And so with the wealth inequality, they wanted to have mandatory public schooling for kids. Believe it or not, although they had public school systems well entrenched by this time, by the 1890s, um, a lot of people uh, drew their children out of school by economic necessity, oftentimes under 12, and made them work with the parents or beside the parents, in addition to the parents, to supplement the family's income. And they said, of course, it was a necessity. And you see that all the way up through like Cesar Chavez, growing up in the early to mid 1900s. And so, at any rate, they wanted to put kids in schools as a stepping stone to the American dream. And they also wanted a tax system. They wanted to be able to tax the wealthy so that they could provide safety net legislation for the less fortunate. They're called progressive or graduated income taxes, right? Whereby they were for the not only the larger amount of money you make, 7% of whatever you're making is going to be more when it's a million than 7% of 30,000, right? But also even a higher percentage for the rich, which was very controversial. It still is, but especially was back then. But they wanted graduated income taxes to tax the wealthy more and higher percentages so that they could provide the states with the money for safety net legislation. And by safety net legislation, like the name implies, when you metaphorically fall on your back, something to catch you, unemployment services, food stamps, some type of programs for people that are seeking employment, and for the city or state or county to help them obtain employment, workers' compensation when people are injured, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So they wanted to do those things. They not only took on wealth inequality, but secondly, they took on class strife or class conflict. That concerned them greatly. So for one, they thought that they were not for the anarchist groups that were beginning to be behind some of the big railroad strikes and other strikes. The Homestead strike, not as much, but like the Pullman strike, the great railroad strike of 1877, you had some people kind of far to the left in some of the labor unions, where some of them were, at least on paper, for the violent overthrow of the government, for the end of the wage system, and for syndicalism, it's called. Syndicalism, syndicalism, is in which it's like a democratic form of communism, where the workers themselves control the means of production, and they also control the allocation of the wealth and the resources. And they do so equitably, evenly to all the other workers, etc. And so the progressives were frightened by people on too far to the left, but they felt like there was a reason why they would get empowered and becoming more popular, is because the more conservative labor unions were too weak, that people were just frustrated because there was no justice. And so they were going to more radical means instead. So at any rate, they look to the standard unions, like the Knights of Labor, right? And the American Federation of Labor, which were much more conservative, where they just wanted no overthrow of the system, nothing systematically different, but just simply better wages, better conditions, fewer working hours, laws to make sure that working conditions were safer, etc. Right? They tried to do. They sought for that. The progressive movement sought to strengthen those types of in the middle of the line labor unions, to give them collective bargaining power, where they can go and they could debate and hanker over conditions, right? Where they could have come to a consensus with their employers as far as what the workers are paid, how many hours they work, what their conditions are like, etc. Okay. They also wanted, in class warfare, they wanted to punish the trusts and the big business and they wanted to do it publicly. And the idea was, right, it's kind of like you see frustration on the left now with the police force, is that if the police force were to be publicly punished, right, that the argument that they might provide some catharsis for the left. Catharsis, right, is a healthy release of their pent up negative emotions, right, that they're in the midst of. And so, hence, perhaps a younger brother getting beaten up by an older brother, mom and dad come home, and the younger brother needs to see his elder brother punished to help give him that cathartic release so he doesn't try to get his brother back later in the future. So same thing here is a lot of the progressives felt it was imperative socially and culturally, right? And with mass psychology to punish the wealthy because it might make the poor less inclined to rebel and feel better about the situation that something is being done. And then also to empower those who are marginalized when it comes to labor strife. They thought if when those at the bottom and the laborers in particular, poor paid laborers are doing better economically, they'll be less inclined to be angry against the rich. I mean, just that simple. And so they were for giving opportunities to the common laborers, to the common people in the neighborhoods through things like we were reading in our handout this week, right? The settlement house movement on number 1 with Jane Addams, Lillian Wald, and others, right? We'll get back to that soon. So they not only tackled wealth inequity, they not only tackled class strife and tried to rectify that, but they also tackled what they perceived to be the disintegration of the nuclear family of mom, dad, and the kids. They were concerned by rising divorce rates. They were concerned by many petty crimes of prostitution and public drunkenness, domestic abuse that all went up supposedly, at least that which was charted statistically during the Gilded Age of the late 1800s. They were concerned by all that, right? So they tackled those issues. They tried to have issued divorce laws that made it very difficult for either spouse to divorce the other. Believe it or not, they tried to do that. And obviously to this day that didn't succeed, but they tried. They tried to even have a national law that stipulated that only physical abuse and abandonment could constitute grounds for a legal divorce, trying to force the families to stay together. Alcoholism, the progressives took on alcohol, right? They called it temperance. And temperance technically means, right, like moderation. They're just against drunkenness. But it went further than that. They wanted to actually ban alcohol in many places. So this largely because there's nothing in Article 1, Section 8 that says Congress alone has power over anything to do with alcohol. So a lot of people in that generation kind of assumed that only the states and local governments, that was reserved for them to deal with. So progressives took it on at the state and local level. In about 9 states, either alcoholism was outright abolished, the consumption of alcohol, or many counties within those states closed and prohibited the production of alcohol. And you have the irony of places like in Tennessee where Jack Daniels was distilled as whiskey. It was declared illegal for people in that city to drink it. So at any rate, a lot of them were later known as blue laws because a lot of it was tied to a colonial history and to the Christian right wanting to end alcoholism. Okay. But it's going to succeed into an actual amendment, right, with prohibition when we get to the 1920s, but not yet. But they're going to take it on at the local and state level. And then prostitution. They took on prostitution. There was a woman named Donaldina Cameron here in California, and she got a lot of publicity taking on the systematic human trafficking of Chinese women, particularly in San Francisco and the areas here in California. And so they tried to take that issue on and try to they took on the triads and the tongs, the Chinese organizations and mafia, and trying to deal with that. And it was kind of 50-50 as far as laws that were passed for the first time by and large in California. Prostitution throughout most of the state, but not at the state level yet, had become declared illegal, etc. All right. And then in addition to wealth inequity, class strife, and disintegration of the nuclear family, progressives try to take on just generically urban problems. So health and sanitation. You had people with no showers, no bathrooms in these tenements buildings, right? Whereby a gentleman would have a buy a property not much bigger than just my office here in my house, which is not very big, as you could see. Um, and they would just build it sky high, right? And make as many apartment rooms as possible so they can gain rent fees from as many tenants as possible. And so they became dilapidated because there were no laws stating that you have to have certain health and safety standards, sanitation standards, right? So a lot of them didn't have windows and air circulation. A lot of them were fire traps. A lot of them didn't have running water or at least a shower or a bathroom, just maybe a sink. So people literally were dumping their excrement to go into the bathroom onto the sides of the streets, out the windows of the buildings. It happened in London, the major cities of Western Europe as well during the Gilded Age. Just a problem with literal filth. Still, people were using the horse for transportation, so horse dung. It was just disgusting, and you could look at this in certain videos and find evidence for this with the progressive movement. But at any rate, they wanted to take that health and sanitation issue on. And like I said, they also wanted to push for health and safety standards with buildings to make sure, right, that we're accustomed to it to this day, that when you're going to go buy a cubicle to work from, you're going to buy a home to live in, it has to pass the inspection, right? And inspections now are very meticulous as far as the strength of the construction of the buildings, right? How far apart the studs have to be, the foundation of the house, the electrical wiring, all that stuff, right? Everything with the roofing and the overlay. And so at any rate, the progressives tried to seek all of that out to deal with health, sanitation, and safety problems in these big cities that were suddenly quadrupling in size during the Gilded Age. And not to mention crime, right? Just it kind of rolls with the numbers where you come from fewer than 1 million to 4.5 million people in your city of Chicago, Detroit, New York, right? Your crime will incidentally rise, right? Even if it's a tiny proportion of those newcomers that have come in, you still have more technically people that are going to engage in deviant or criminal activity. And so they wanted to strengthen and make modern police forces and sheriff's deputies' offices. They wanted to have strict codes of criminal laws and penalties for those infringement on those laws. They wanted to have modern system of this, the beginning of thumbprints and mugshots to try to canvass and find suspect criminals. Okay. So they worked on that as well. And then Parks and Rec, right? With Parks and Rec, there was a belief, right? Excuse me, during the Gilded Age that, or particularly strong in the Gilded Age, it's been elsewhere as well, but that people need a release, especially people that are working 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, and that they need to have a release at least 1 day a week and find and like again using that word to have experience some type of catharsis, to let their negative emotions out and feelings, have some release. So at any rate, there was a big push for public parks, playgrounds for children, and not to mention the beginnings of local recreational sports. The progressives were behind that, and the first areas they went to were the marginalized areas. And to me, marginalized is that you're metaphorically kept to the corner. The opportunities that are available for other people are not available for you, okay? And so they went to these poor, oftentimes ethnic enclave. Remember, enclave is like ENCLAVE. It's like a Chinatown. It's an ethnically homogenous area, and oftentimes they're poor, and it's almost perceived to be a necessity that they pull together with one another and help one another out economically, psychologically, etc., culturally and socially. So at any rate, they would go into these poor little Italies, these Chinatowns and other areas, right? And they would try to provide sports, because the idea was that the kids, if they, because the sociology was coming of age, and the progressives really embraced sociology, and they really came by and large to believe that we are who we are more by nurture than we are by nature. So that your DNA code to the progressives means less as far as the person you're going to end up becoming than will mean your upbringing, your environment, your surroundings, your circumstances. So hence to the progressives, right? They by and large thought that criminal activity could almost be done away with. They thought that crime and criminals were bred, right? That they were given no hope, that they were marginalized and frustrated, and that they were given too much idle time in some cases when unemployment was high and they have large layoffs, etc. And just being on the streets was just bad temptation for them. And so hence they wanted to get these kids on football teams, on soccer teams, on basketball teams, etc. Get them to come to the local YMCA club, etc. To get them off the streets, to give them hope, and to literally divert their attention from their cycle of poverty, right? So any questions so far? All right. So number 3, court history. What does it claim of the progressives? Is that they were altruistic do-gooders. Remember, altruistic is you put the needs of others above yourself. So that's number 1 on your handout if you choose that one. And so with number 1, right, just look for evidence of them being selfless, of them not having much to gain themselves as far as their own self-interest and what they did to help out the poor, etc. All right. And we'll get more into well, actually, maybe that is the time that I want to do that, is right now. Let's go back to the settlement house program, right? The settlement houses, people like Jane Addams in Chicago and Lillian Wald in New York, they would go into this poor, marginalized ethnic enclave area, right? And they would buy a couple large buildings, right? Oftentimes it was philanthropically provided. It was charitable donations from wealthy progressive patrons. But sometimes the government stepped in, and they would buy the properties, and they would provide free of charge schooling for the kids and for the parents, English classes and college classes for the parents, daycare for the parents of their children, obviously. They provided sports, again. They had parties, dances, balls, as they called them, right? Dances and other, they would read in sometimes to the culture, like Jane Addams, of the Central American, Polish, Hungarian population in her area of Chicago. And they would celebrate traditional holidays that they had experienced and celebrated back in Europe, and to try to make them feel more welcomed and at home. And so you have pictures like in the textbook of the progressives having a little immigrant kid in a bathtub and they're bathing him, etc., right? And a lot of the settlement house movement volunteers were just that. They were volunteers. Jane Addams, for instance, her father was a preacher and was supposedly very philanthropic. He did a lot of charitable things, and he motivated her to try to have a sense of purpose in her life, some type of selfless crusade that's larger than herself. She also was wealthy, which helped, and so she could go to Europe, and she saw the Salvation Army and the Red Cross and other organizations doing really well there and doing great works for the poverty-stricken people in Bristol, Liverpool, and London, etc. And she wanted to implement that back here. So when she comes back, right, she and people like Lillian Wald established these places to provide these services for the kids and for their parents, okay, to give them hope and to give them an opportunity to socially and economically ascend. And another thing that they provided was job training and actual links to local employers. They would make deals and have links with local employers whereby they would give aptitude tests to the poor people that were in their settlement houses, and to see what their strengths and weaknesses were. and and if they saw a strength that allied with some employer or some business in the local area, they would communicate with that local employer and cut deals with those employers to try to get them a job with them. And speaking of which, a gentleman who kind of paid it forward after having that happen for him was Jacob Riis, Riis. He's on number one as well, a Danish immigrant who kind of lost hope. He was educated, he was college educated, and very good writer. But he just kept having minimal chances at blue collar jobs, and then became an alcoholic. He was found by progressives. He was brought into a settlement house. They gave him an aptitude test, found that he was educated and could write well, and they helped secure him a job as a journalist. Well, after a while working as a journalist, he went into a dilapidated area of New York City and Manhattan called the Five Points. And the Five Points had already been demolished and rebuilt just a couple decades before. And what they found was just incredible as far as the poverty and the misery, the crime. They had several buildings where dead bodies were littered throughout the walls, inside the walls of the buildings, because there was a crime syndicate that was involved making money off of mugging and killing people, using prostitutes to lure them into rooms. So the Five Points had a very bad reputation. Not to mention the gangs of New York, right? Like the movie. Of course, that was hyperbolic. They exaggerated on some stuff, but the basics are true, supposedly, according to the primary sources, as far as ethnic groups forming these these raucous gangs, if you will, and having very visible public fights that involved weapons that where people were not just beaten up, they were murdered, okay, in these big public fights. So at any rate, he went into the Five Points, and he ended up writing a book called How the Other Half Lives. And if you have time to look into that, it's really interesting. It's very moving, as he provides pictures, just very, just pity-inducing pictures of people living in just the most awful condition. Little orphan kids laying over gutters on the street, sleeping throughout the night by themselves. 7 or 8 people claustrophobically clumped up in one little airless, windowless, bathroomless room. You name it, it was there. And so he took these pictures and put them into a book, and that they were known as muckrakers, like Jacob Riis. Is their critics claim that they were stirring the muck, right? Is they wanted to find the dark underbelly of society, and they wanted to expose it to the light, to public. Why? So that they could create a sense of public indignation. Indignation, going back to like religious history, is righteous anger, right? It's something that you ought to be angry about. And so they wanted to provoke indignation publicly so that the public would put pressure on their elected and appointed civil servants to do something about that problem, okay? So Jacob Riis really helped out with his How the Other Half Lives, as far as people declaring urban blight and having standards for health, safety, and sanitation and buildings, etc. All right. Not to mention parks and sports programs for kids. Riis was connected to that as well. All right. Any questions on number 3? All right. Number 4. Revisionists say, we see a selfish side to these guys, to these progressives. For one, right, Richard Hofstadter wrote back in the 60s, these older middle class people were being eclipsed by the wealthy robber baron class. They had once been seen as the cream of the crop, as the lawyers and writers and university professors, etc., right? And now everybody was deferring to the robber barons as the new heroes of the age, so that there was a bit of jealousy of losing their spot. They were oftentimes, just on account of their prestige and their education, chosen to represent the local chambers of commerce and other fraternal organizations. And now the robber barons increasingly began being appointed to those local and state and national positions instead of them. So some people think that it was a little bit of jealousy and sour grapes on behalf of the progressives, that they wanted to punish big business for themselves because they enviously did not enjoy how well big business was doing. All right. And also, the sense that they were anxious about, they were fearful of the future about a class warfare, right? Going back to Jane Addams, she did say that her father and her desire to have purpose in her life, right, motivated her. But she was also very honest, and she said as well that she also was motivated by the fact that women had few opportunities, and so she couldn't do much else. And so it was one of the few open opportunities for a woman to make herself feel wanted and needed. But also, she said that she had lost a family member in the Pullman strike, and that she was scared that the rich and the poor were going to have a war, that there was going to be like a revolutionary uprising by the radical labor unions, the laborers and the poor of this country. And she didn't want to get caught in the middle of that, obviously, because her family members could die, she could die, and her own wealth was at stake because she was in a wealthy position. She stood much to lose. So that's another thing that revisionists claim on number 4 is that progressives were a bit selfish in their concern that this was not just altruistic, that they weren't just staying up at night worrying about the poor for their own sake, right? Just for the poor's sake, but that they were concerned this whole system's going to come down and we're going to lose everything that we have if we don't placate the poor, if we don't appease them, if we don't take away some of their anger and satisfy them to some degree. So some people look at that as well when it comes to number 4, when it comes to revisionists, right? And their histories of progressives. And another one, let me add one more. I didn't have this down on my notes, but just in case it's on the test, is also some people call them middle-class tyrants. Excuse me. And that they were trying to make mini-me's of these people in the settlement houses. They were trying to teach what they called middle-class values, right? And the middle class, by middle-class values, I mean highly valuing education, being very abstemious in your personal behavior. Abstemious means you refrain from giving into your passions, to your Freudian id, right? What your impulses want you to do. And so hence you don't engage in drunkenness and sexual immorality, etc. You don't go and spend all your money recklessly, but that you're frugal and self-controlled. They tried to contend that this was a middle-class phenomenon, right? These values, and that they wanted to make the poor into their own image, into this middle-class image. So they told people not to drink, like I said, not to engage in certain types of behaviors. And so some people saw them as tyrannical, right? And trying to impose their will and their image of the ideal American onto other people. Okay? So any question on number 4? All right, number 5 is that I make the argument, this is a conservative argument to this day, that progressives went away from what the founding fathers wanted. That the founding fathers were all about equality of opportunity, but nothing further than that. So that everyone theoretically has a chance to compete for a loan and start a business, has a chance to compete for a spot in the college or university, right? But that whoever God or nature endows with the best talent, then that's just the way it is. Matter of fact, our founding fathers, including Andrew Jackson, used the term natural aristocracy, that they had no problem with a group of people rising to the top, right? As long as it wasn't arbitrary and unfair by family name or just given to them automatically, but that it was earned by them by their own talent and hard work, etc., right? And so the conservative argument is that progressives, and for bigger government and for punishing the rich and for helping out the poor, the conservative argument is, right, is that goes away from what the founding fathers wanted, is that they just simply were for equality of opportunity. And what you do or do not make of that opportunity is on you and not up to the government to give you further help. And so hence there's the idea that you're going to provide a permanently dependent class of people that are going to have their hands out for handouts, right, from the government to provide them automatic jobs, to provide them unemployment checks, workers' compensation, etc. Right, and that they like an animal that you continue to feed, and it no longer hunts and gets its own food, and it no longer becomes self-sufficient, so that you're actually harming people by helping them out too much, the poor that is. So that's the conservative argument, right? For number 5, any questions or comments? All right, and then number 6, I do a 180, and I defend the progressives, and they contend, wait a minute, right? There are they show it in sociology especially, right? There may be something to this theory of cycles of poverty, right? Whereby people, because mom and dad are poor, the kid has to drop out of school and has no choice, right? Because don't have enough to make ends meet, you literally have to work, and you can't go to college, you can't go to school, because you have to be immediately earning, right? Um, Even more dramatic than that, you're an African American, let's say, in Detroit, and they just won't give you a job because of the color of your skin and your youth as a young black man. So what do? You look to alternative means of enrichment, right? So you sell drugs, or you do engage in some type of theft or criminal activity to compensate for what is lacking. So to the progressives, they say, no, it's not that easy. It's not that simple. It's not that black and white of just opening up colleges to everyone, opening up jobs and credit and loans to everyone. That some people are mired in a cycle of hopelessness and poverty that they need a little extra help to be pulled out of. So special scholarships just for poor African American young men, etc. Right? That's a progressive idea, that they need a little extra help to get out of their cycle of poverty. Okay. And so as far as the founding fathers, if they don't like that, I write in number 6, then so be it. They didn't pretend that they even pretend to want future generations to adhere completely to their paradigm. That's why they gave wiggle room in the Constitution, not even beginning to know what conditions and what circumstances and problems future generations might face. All right. Any questions on 6? All right. Number 7, the settlement house movement. I've already done that with one exception, right? That is, not only did they try to provide upward mobility for the marginalized in these settlement houses, but there's a debate on their cultural sensitivity. I mentioned Jane Addams, right? Where she was very receptive to the culture, the traditions of the Hungarians and the Pole immigrants there in Chicago. But let's go to like Lillian Wald, right? There was a young girl named Rahel Golub, Rahel, and then last name Golub. She was a Russian Jewish girl, immigrant with her dad, and they still didn't have the money to pay for her younger sister and her mother to be brought over to New York with them. So they were saving up every penny. She recalls a time when she began working with the young girls in the workplace, and the girls were bragging about what they were buying with their salaries working in this factory. So she came home and said, Dad, what if I kept a few cents from my job so I can buy such and such? And she said her dad gave her the biggest guilt trip, that she just wanted to just hide away and never, ever again dare ask her father if she can keep a cent of her own salary. That the culture of her house, by necessity, was communal. That you don't think selfishly. You don't think of yourself. You're just one cog in the wheel. You think of your sister still back in Russia. You think of your mom. You do everything you can to pitch into the common good, right? For your family and for your culture and your community, etc. And so hence, Lillian Wald and others would come and visit her and ask her why she was no longer coming to their Cherry Street settlement house. And they brought her home with a Bible, and she was Jewish. And right, with Judaism, they didn't accept Jesus as their Messiah. So there's a big difference with regarding Christ and religion, right? So she brings home a Bible, and her dad just flipped. And she writes this into a story, and it becomes famous. And so at any rate, some people believe, again, that with the settlement houses, that they were being ethnocentric. They were being arrogant and self-centered about their own ethnicity and culture as being kind of well-to-do WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And they were trying to make little mini-me's of these immigrants. And they didn't have good cultural, they didn't practice good cultural sensitivity sometimes to the community, the culture, the values, and the expected normative behavior that these kids were growing up in their immigrant neighborhoods and families. All right, any questions? All right, and then just one more. Teddy Roosevelt as a progressive president, okay, was for one, he wanted to punish or regulate big business for the country to see. So I need you to remember that. So for one, right, he went after the trusts, right? He went after the trust, the Northern Securities Company, which was a railroad trust. J.P. Morgan was behind. He had it broken up. He had his Department of Justice sue them for being in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and had their trust broken up. And the public loved it, right? He also wanted to regulate big business through the Federal Meat Inspection Act. The Federal Meat Inspection Act, right, was largely a reaction to Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. I don't know if you had to read that in high school, but right, it talks about the working conditions in a meat producing factory, and mice and rats fall into the grinders and get grinded in with the hot dogs. As do people's hands getting mangled in the machines, and they don't even stop the production process because that would mean a diminution or becoming smaller of their profits. So in the name of profiteering, they just let this system continue, right? With all these unsafe conditions, unsanitary conditions, right? And Sinclair liked to joke that he aimed for America's heart and he reached our stomach instead. For heart, he wanted socialism, which didn't come about, but with hitting people's stomach, what did come about was a Federal Meat Inspection Act that stated that meat and it spread to other industries as well, food producing industries have to have certain standards, right? So as far as sweeping and mopping and sterilizing, as far as machines that could cut members of your body off, etc., all that now has to be taken into account, right? Of course, we have drama to this day about, steroids and other things given to cows, etc. And so it's still an ongoing thing, but this is the beginning of that discourse publicly, people talking about it and dealing with it. And it was known as the Federal Meat Inspection Act that Teddy Roosevelt was largely behind and regulating big business. All right, so he busted trust, he regulated big business, right? Another instance of regulation were the railroads. They were known as the Hepburn and Elkins Acts. And what they did is he made railroads turn in regular reports of their business transactions so the government could see what they were up to, see the lands that they were given by Congress, what they were using those lands for. Because remember, you had episodes like that. My son's being silly over here. But you had episodes like the Credit Mobilier scandal, whereby railroads were getting money from Congress to build a bridge that they ended up not even building, but they pretended as if they had built it so they can keep the money. And so stuff like that. So with the Hepburn and the Elkins Acts, now railroads had to turn in information to the government on a regular basis, and they formed the Interstate Commerce Commission, which would decide, right, if railroad rates had become too high and actually enforce it. So for the first time, our federal government put price ceilings on a service, right, and said, railroads, you can't charge more than this many cents per pound, etc. So those all are examples of Teddy Roosevelt punishing or regulating big business. Also, a part of his progressive platform as president is he wanted to mediate class warfare. He took a very paternalistic pose in his rhetoric and in his actions. Like, to him, right, you actually have quotes to support this, okay? I'm not going too far out on a limb in this paraphrase, but like, oh, my children, my children. The labor unions and workers are getting too radical. They're getting too violent. They're expecting too much. The employers are fat, happy, and greedy and arrogant and won't do anything to give any concessions to their workers. So he claimed as if he was being unnerved and concerned by both segments, right? And he wanted to mediate as the umpire, as the referee between the two. So most famously was the Pennsylvania coal miner strike. He came in, when the employers were acting arrogantly, he supposedly threatened to get physical with one of them, and then threatened them and said that if they did not come to terms with the labor union, that he was going to confiscate the properties of this mining association and give the coal out for free to the local people. And of course, the employers didn't want that to happen. But this is the first time a president had intervened and done something like that. And so now they went to the table and they agreed to terms. Terms that the workers wanted were not met, but they met in the middle. So hence, afterwards, Teddy Roosevelt was very proud of himself, and he stated that he had given both sides a square deal, right? Had given them both a fair shot. So at any rate, he also was for regulations at the workplace, like I said, with the Federal Meat Inspection Act, etc. So regulating the work conditions, an 8-hour day he was for, right? Okay, unions, power to collectively bargain, like in the miner strike, right? And to come to terms over their work conditions. Absolutely, he was for that as well. Okay, and then also what I wanted to do is I wanted to mention a guy named Hofstadter. Okay, again, remember this is the guy who said that the progressives were anxious about being eclipsed. They were jealous of big business, right? It's the same author. His spelling is Hofstadter. Richard Hofstadter. At any rate, to me, he gave a very interesting psychological thesis about Teddy Roosevelt that I want to share, okay? And that is, okay, is Teddy Roosevelt, when you look at his primary sources, at what he wrote, his speeches, he kept regular correspondence with his sister, wrote a lot to her, right? It was very introspective and wrote a lot about his introspection on paper. So he's one of the few presidents that we have a surplus of primary source material from his own hand, right? Supposedly trying to dive or delve into his brain and what motivated him. What he liked to pride himself on, right, was that he was a man of purpose and of depth, that he didn't want to just live a shallow, wealthy life, because he was brought up wealthy. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, metaphorically, okay? But to him, it was a grievous, grievous, selfish sin to just simply enjoy your own private wealth, live for pleasure and fun, and do nothing else with your life and not make it count. Because to him, right, he believed in noblesse oblige, in the nobleman's obligation. It comes from medieval chivalric code back in Europe, is that if God made you to be wealthy, if he put you in a position of power, he did it for a purpose, and he expects you to do something with it. He expects you to put it to some end so you help those who cannot help themselves. You engage in some type of chivalric help and protection for the less fortunate. And he supposedly is going to take that very seriously, right? And another thing that's interesting to the psychology of it, Hofstadter incorporates, right, is his notion of social Darwinism, okay? With social Darwinism, he did believe, although he was Christian, he did believe into a lot of the tenets of social Darwinism, that there is a lot of truth to survival of the fittest, that the weak in all species tend to die out, those who don't adapt and those who don't strengthen themselves and those who don't show at times some sort of assertion and even aggression. And so when he was young, this idea was entrenched. It was made deeper by his sickliness and the fact that kids made fun of him when he was young. And he had something akin to tuberculosis, a pulmonary ailment that kept him out of school often when he was really young. And at times they thought he would die from. And so his father pulled him aside one day and said, "Son, basically, if you don't learn to fight, if you don't learn to grind and make yourself stronger and tougher, you're never going to make it in this world." And so the term often used and associated with Teddy Roosevelt is the strenuous life, right? No pain, no gain. That if you don't have a strenuous life, if you're not metaphorically, or in his case, literally, lifting weights and stretching your muscles, then you're not going to make it well in the future. Okay. So going back to this idea of the nobleman's obligation, is he not only thought it was selfish and unchristian for the other wealthy kids that he went to Harvard with to see them just indulge in their private lives and enjoy their own fun, rich celebrity status, but he also thought that that was unmanly, that the manly thing to do was to fight. And some of that also goes back to Rome. If you look at people like Tacitus and Cicero, who they fought for the Roman army, and when their bodies became elder and they couldn't do it physically, they fought for the poor and they fought for other people in another way as politicians. And you see that with Teddy Roosevelt, according to Hofstadter, that he found a sense of purpose in sticking up for the less fortunate and help fighting for the less fortunate. But as Hofstadter contends, there's a limit to this. He was also conservative. As a wealthy man, he was not for any form of Marxism, where wealth is equally distributed to people, right? He wasn't into giving his wealth up for anybody without his own accord, without his own choice. He was not for the workers, like with syndicalism, as I mentioned, running the factories themselves. He was not that far to the left at all. He was much more conservative. And not only that, J.P. Morgan came to his office one day when his trust was being busted by Roosevelt's administration and basically said, "Is this what I'm to expect in the future? Are you going to go after my other trusts?" Teddy Roosevelt tells him, basically, behave yourself, hence his paternalistic talk as president, right? Like he's everyone's dad. As long as you and your other trusts are behaving yourself and you're not grinding your workers to the ground, right? I'll leave you alone. And he said, plus the people needed to see this because the poor are up in arms. They needed to see this, like again, for some catharsis. And so you see a more conservative side to Teddy Roosevelt also as a progressive, that he wasn't that radical as may have seemed at the surface. All right. And then lastly, preservation and conservation. Remember, with conservation, it's just like rules. Like for every tree you chop down, let's say Weyerhaeuser or International Paper up in the state of Washington, they own a lot of property and a forest area. They have to, for every tree they chop down, they got to plant seeds for a new one for the future, right? So conservation is responsible stewardship. Being a steward is like being a babysitter, right? The idea that we are stewards of the resources that we have and we need to use them well for future generations, right? So he was for conservation, but also preservation. And preservation implies permanent, right? Keep some of the forest as national and state parks. Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to enact that, right? With John Muir and the preservationists. Now, he was not necessarily so caught up like John Muir and others into some of their beliefs on nature and their love for nature. But one thing that I have read about him is, for one, he did also, kind of like when I mentioned Parks and Rec, he did believe that everyone needs release and that everyone needs an opportunity to have at least one vacation a year and go to the mountains and go hiking and clear their head, get away from all the busyness and the strife and the chaos of urban life, and restart their engine, right? Replenish their battery, fire it up, right? Recharge it. And so he did believe that with nature, that it had that type of invigorating effect. Remember, this is a wealthy guy who went to the Dakotas for a couple years and became a rancher. But also, is he had a friend, right? His friend's name was Pinchot, Pinchot. He and Pinchot would go on hikes together quite often, right? And they would have talks. They both were wealthy young kids who were born into wealth, went to Ivy League schools, right? But they would talk about how a lot of other people did not have that opportunity, did not have that privilege, right? And they said if they let all the most beautiful areas and landscapes in this country be open to private consumption, all that would happen is, as happens in all the other facets of life, the wealthy would buy them up. They would fence them in and keep the rest of the public from being able to enjoy it. So to him, there really was a socioeconomic part to his preservation, is he wanted the common person to be able to come pay a very small, affordable fee to the government and enjoy a city-state park, Yosemite, Yellowstone, etc., right? And not allow the wealthy to monopolize such a beautiful landscape and experience. All right. Any questions? Any questions at all? Allison, Eurizia? All right, girls, I will give you extra credit. All right, thank you for getting on. And just please have this progressive handout submitted by Sunday night at midnight, okay? And you guys keep up what you're doing. I hope you guys are doing well. And I'll get back to you. If in the future, next week or whatever, I'm pending some medical tests right now. I may have pneumonia. So just kind of FYI, just in case if I'm not physically up to doing this next week, I'll think of something. I'll do something. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for staying on. I hope you have a good day. And if there aren't any questions, girls, I'm going to go ahead and close off. Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I
Have
appreciate
a wonderful.
you as well.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
You too, hon. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.